The Valkyrie Dominion had ruled the stars for 3,000 years, and in all that time, they had never failed to conquer a species they targeted. Their method was simple and brutal, and it had worked on over 300 worlds across the Orion arm of the galaxy. First, they would send scout ships to find young civilizations that had not yet discovered faster than light travel. Then they would arrive with a massive fleet and demand total surrender. The species that surrendered quickly were taken as slaves and put to work in mines and factories across Dominion space. The species that resisted were crushed without mercy, and their survivors were taken as slaves. Anyway, no one had ever beaten the Valkyrie, and no one had ever escaped. Their chains once captured High Arbiter Keth Voran sat in his command throne aboard the flagship Eternal Dominion and reviewed the latest scouting report with mild interest. The scouts had found a small blue planet orbiting a yellow star in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. The inhabitants called their world Earth, and they called themselves humans. The scouting data made Keth Voran smile with all three of his mouths. These humans were perfect targets in every way. They had primitive technology that was barely capable of reaching their own moon. They had no unified government, and instead split their world into hundreds of competing nations. Most amusing of all, they seemed to spend most of their time and resources fighting among themselves over patches of land and different beliefs. The High Arbiter had seen this pattern many times before. A divided species was an easy species to conquer. He authorized a standard subjugation fleet of 12 warships and 40 transport vessels to carry the new slaves back to Dominion space. It would be a routine operation, and he expected his commanders to return within one planetary cycle with a full cargo of human workers. The fleet arrived in Earth's solar system on what the humans called a Tuesday. Commander Vethlar ordered his communications officer to broadcast the standard surrender demand on all frequencies. The message was simple and left no room for negotiation. The humans had one planetary rotation to surrender unconditionally or face total annihilation. Vethlar expected panic and chaos and desperate attempts to negotiate. What he got instead confused him deeply. For the first 6 hours, the humans did not respond at all. Instead, something strange began happening on the planet below. The nations that had been pointing weapons at each other for decades suddenly stopped. Leaders who had refused to speak to each other for years were suddenly in constant communication. Military forces that had been enemies for generations began coordinating their movements. By hour 12, the humans still had not responded to the surrender demand, but their nuclear missiles were being moved. Thousands of weapons that had been aimed at other human nations were being repositioned to point upward at the sky. Vethlar found this behavior puzzling, but not alarming. What could primitive nuclear weapons do against Valkyrie shields that could withstand the heat of a star? At hour 20, the humans finally sent their response. It was not a surrender. It was not a negotiation. It was a single word transmitted in every human language simultaneously. The word was no. Then the missiles launched. Vethlar watched his display screens with growing horror as over 100,000 nuclear warheads rose from every continent on Earth. The humans had not panicked. They had not surrendered. They had spent 20 hours preparing the largest coordinated attack in their history. The first wave of missiles hit the Valkyrie shields, and the shields held easily. The second wave hit, and the shields flickered, but held. The third, fourth, and fifth waves came in rapid succession, and the shield generators began to overheat. By the 10th wave, 3 Valkyrie warships were burning, and Vethlar realized he had made a terrible mistake. These humans were not like any species the Dominion had conquered before. They did not surrender when faced with superior force. They did not accept defeat as inevitable. Instead, they had unified in hours and thrown everything they had at the enemy without hesitation. Vethlar ordered retreat, but the missiles kept coming. 2 more warships exploded before the fleet could engage their faster-than-light drives and escape. The surviving ships limped back to Dominion space, carrying news that would shake the Empire to its core. A primitive species had driven off a Valkyrie fleet on Earth. The humans watched the enemy ships flee, and they did not celebrate for long. They knew the aliens would return, and they knew next time the fleet would be much larger. But something had changed on that Tuesday. For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth had a common enemy. The old wars and old hatreds did not disappear overnight, but they suddenly seemed small and petty compared to the threat from the stars. Within 1 month, the United Earth Council was formed with representatives from every nation. Within 1 year, construction began on orbital defense platforms, using every resource the planet could provide, and in secret laboratories around the world, the brightest human minds began studying the wreckage that had fallen from the destroyed Valkyrie ships. The aliens had made a critical error in their attack. They had shown humanity that faster than light travel was possible. They had provided samples of their technology, and they had given humanity something it had never truly had before. Unity the Valkyrie had come to Earth expecting to find easy prey. They had expected a divided species that would crumble at the first show of force. Instead, they had found something else entirely. They had found a species that stopped fighting itself the moment a greater threat appeared. They had found a species that would rather die than kneel. They had found a species that learned from its enemies and improved with terrifying speed. The High Arbiter received the news of the failed conquest with cold fury. He immediately ordered a proper invasion fleet to be assembled. This time there would be no demands for surrender. This time the humans would be taught what happened to species that defied the Dominion. But assembling a proper fleet took time, and the Valkyrie did not realize that time was the one thing they could not afford to give humanity. Because while the Dominion gathered its forces, the humans were working day and night. They were learning, they were building, and they were preparing for the war that would change the galaxy forever. The aliens had come to enslave Earth. They had no idea what they had awakened. The 15 years that followed the first Valkyrie attack became known as the Acceleration, and nothing like it had ever happened in human history. Every nation on Earth poured its resources into a single goal, understanding alien technology and building weapons to fight back. The wreckage from the destroyed Valkyrie ships had scattered across 3 continents, and recovery teams worked around the clock to gather every piece. Scientists from countries that had been enemies for generations now worked side by side in massive underground laboratories. Old rivalries meant nothing when extinction was the alternative. Darayuki Tanaka was 32 years old when she was assigned to lead the propulsion research team in a facility beneath the mountains of Japan. She had spent her career studying theoretical physics and had written papers about faster-than-light travel that her colleagues had called impossible. Now she held pieces of an actual FTL drive in her hands, and she had to figure out how it worked. The first 3 years were nothing but frustration and failure. The Valkyrie technology operated on principles that human science had never imagined. Their power sources used elements that did not exist on Earth. Their computers processed information in ways that made no logical sense. Many scientists gave up and said it could not be done. Dr. Tanaka refused to quit. She worked 18-hour days and slept in her laboratory and filled thousands of notebooks with calculations and theories. In the 4th year, she had a breakthrough. She discovered that the Valkyrie FTL drive did not actually move the ship faster than light. Instead, it folded space itself and allowed the ship to skip across vast distances in an instant. Once she understood the principle, the engineering became possible. It took another 2 years to build a working prototype, and another year to make it safe enough for human use. On the 7th anniversary of the first attack, Dr. Tanaka watched a small unmanned probe vanish from Earth orbit and reappear near Mars 3 seconds later. Humanity had achieved faster than light travel. In a military facility in North America, Colonel Marcus Webb was working on a different problem. He had spent 20 years commanding soldiers in wars against other humans. Now he had to design a warship that could fight aliens with technology centuries ahead of anything Earth had ever built. The captured Valkyrie data cores had been partially decoded. By teams of linguists and hackers working together, they revealed something important about Valkyrie combat doctrine. The aliens relied completely on their superior technology. Their shields were strong and their weapons were powerful, but their tactics were simple and predictable. They had never faced an enemy that could match their technology, so they had never learned to fight clever. Colonel Webb saw an opportunity in this weakness. Humans had spent thousands of years fighting each other, and had developed countless strategies and tactics for war. What if human ships could not match Valkyrie firepower, but could outthink them? He designed the first human warship around this concept. The ship would be smaller and faster than Valkyrie vessels. It would carry weapons that could be modified quickly in battle, and it would be crewed by soldiers trained to adapt and improvise in ways the aliens had never seen. The ship was built in orbit over 3 years, using salvaged alien alloys and human engineering. They called it the UES Defiance, and it was ugly and crude compared to the elegant Valkyrie warships. But it was theirs, and it was ready to fight. While the engineers and scientists worked, the intelligence teams made their own discoveries. The decoded Valkyrie data cores contained more than just technical information. They contained records of every species the Dominion had conquered. 300 worlds enslaved over 3,000 years, billions of beings working in chains to serve their Valkyrie masters. The humans read these records with growing anger. The Valkyrie did not see other species as equals or even as enemies worth respecting. They saw them as resources to be harvested like animals. This was the fate that awaited humanity if they lost. This what the Dominion had planned for Earth from the beginning. The information spread across the planet, and any humans who had doubted the need for war changed their minds. This was not just about survival anymore. This was about refusing to become slaves. In the 15th year since first contact, the Valkyrie finally returned. High Arbiter Kethvarin had assembled a proper conquest fleet this time. 80 warships dropped out of FTL at the edge of the solar system, ready to crush the primitive humans once and for all. What they found made the Valkyrie commanders freeze in shock. A human fleet was waiting for them. 32 warships hung in formation near the orbit of Neptune. They were smaller than Valkyrie vessels, and their construction was rough and unpolished. But they existed, and that should have been impossible. No species had ever reverse-engineered Valkyrie technology this quickly. No species had ever built a war fleet in just 15 years. The humans had done both. Admiral Chun Weilin commanded the human fleet from the bridge of the Defiance. She was 61 years old and had spent her entire military career preparing for this moment. She knew her ships were outgunned and outnumbered. She also knew that her crews were ready to die before they let a single alien reach Earth. She opened communications with the Valkyrie fleet and spoke in their own language, which human linguists had decoded years ago. She told them to turn around and leave. She told them that Earth was not a slave world and never would be. The Valkyrie commander laughed and ordered his fleet to attack. The Battle of Neptune's Reach began. For 11 hours, the two fleets tore into each other. In the darkness between worlds, human ships darted and weaved using tactics the Valkyrie had never encountered. They attacked in coordinated groups, targeting shield generators and engine systems. They used asteroids as cover and fired from unexpected angles. When their weapons failed, they rammed their crippled ships into enemy vessels. The Valkyrie fought with superior firepower, but they could not adapt to human unpredictability. Ship after ship fell to tactics they had never trained to counter. When the battle finally ended, 43 Valkyrie ships fled into FTL, leaving 37 wrecks behind. The human fleet had lost 19 ships, including the Defiance. Admiral Chun had crashed her flagship into the Valkyrie command ship when all her weapons were destroyed. Both vessels burned together in the cold void, but Earth was safe. Word of the battle spread across the Dominion at the speed of light. The primitives had won. The slaves had beaten their would-be masters, and the galaxy would never be the same. 6 months after the Battle of Neptune's Reach, Admiral Chun Wei-Lin was buried with full military honors in a ceremony watched by every human on Earth. She had become a symbol of humanity's refusal to surrender. Schools were named after her, and statues were built in her image, and children grew up hearing stories of how she had rammed her ship into the enemy rather than retreat. But the war was far from over. The Valkyrie Dominion was wounded and embarrassed, but it was not defeated across the galaxy. Other species watched and waited to see what would happen next. The United Earth Council met in emergency session to decide humanity's next move. Some leaders argued for defense. They wanted to build more ships and more weapons and wait for the Valkyrie to attack again. Others argued for negotiation. Perhaps the Dominion would accept peace now that they knew humans could fight back. Admiral Jiang Wei-Lin stood before the council and proposed a third option. He was the younger brother of the fallen Admiral Chun, and he had commanded one of the surviving ships at Neptune's Reach. He had seen the Valkyrie data about their slave worlds. He had read the reports about species that had been conquered and broken and forgotten. And he had a plan that would change the course of galactic history. He called it the Wolf Doctrine. The strategy was simple in concept, but terrifying in ambition. Humanity would not wait for the Dominion to attack again. Humanity would not beg for peace from slavers. Instead, humanity would take the war to the enemy. Human fleets would push into Dominion space and strike at their worlds and their infrastructure, but they would not conquer. They would liberate every slave species freed from Dominion. Chains would be offered a choice: join humanity in an alliance against the slavers or remain neutral and rebuild in peace. Admiral Jiang believed that the Dominion's greatest weakness was the billions of slaves that powered their empire. If those slaves were freed and armed, the Dominion would collapse from within. The council debated for 3 days. Many called the plan insane and suicidal. How could humanity fight an empire that spanned thousands of worlds? How could they project power across distances that took years to cross, even at faster than light speeds? Admiral Jiang had answers for every objection. Human shipyards were already building new vessels faster than anyone had thought possible. Human engineers had improved on Valkyrie FTL technology and could now travel even faster than Dominion ships. And human soldiers were volunteering in numbers that overwhelmed the recruitment centers. Every person who signed up knew they might never come home. They signed up anyway. The council approved the Wolf Doctrine by a vote of 147 to 12. The dissenting votes were recorded and respected, but the decision was made: humanity was going on the offensive. The first target was a mining world called Keth Prime. The Keth were an insectoid species that had been enslaved by the Dominion 800 years ago. They had been workers and builders for so long that most had forgotten their people had ever been free. A Valkyrie garrison of 2,000 soldiers controlled a population of 50 million Keth slaves. The Human Liberation Fleet arrived without warning. 12 warships dropped out of FTL and immediately engaged the Dominion defense platforms. The battle in orbit lasted only 2 hours before the last Valkyrie ship was destroyed. Then the troop transports descended. 10,000 human marines landed on Keth Prime, armed with weapons and translation devices. They did not come as conquerors. They came as liberators. The Keth did not know what to make of these strange, soft-skinned aliens who spoke their language badly but carried medicine and food instead of chains. The humans asked nothing in return. They simply said that no species should be slaves and that the Dominion's time was ending. When the last Valkyrie soldier on the planet was killed, the humans gathered the Keth leaders and made their offer: join us and fight for your freedom, or stay here and rebuild your world in peace. The Keth chose to fight. 8 centuries of rage and humiliation had been waiting for this moment. Within 1 year, 30,000 Keth warriors had joined the growing human fleet. They brought knowledge of Dominion systems and patrol routes and weaknesses, and they brought a hatred for the Valkyrie that burned hotter than any star. The liberation of Keth Prime was only the beginning. Over the next 5 years, human fleets struck at Dominion worlds again and again. Each victory freed another slave species. Each freed species provided more soldiers and ships and intelligence. The Moravi were a graceful winged species that the Dominion had used for genetic experiments. Human doctors spent months healing the damage that had been done to their people when the Moravi were strong enough to fight. They joined the alliance with fierce determination. The Groth were a massive reptilian species that had been used as shock troops by the Dominion. They had been conditioned to obey and to kill without question. Human psychologists worked to break that conditioning and restore their free will when the Voyager there. Groth finally understood what had been done to them. Their fury was terrible. They became the most feared warriors in the Allied fleet. A dozen more species joined over the following years. Some contributed ships and soldiers. Others provided technology or resources, or simply safe harbors for Allied fleets. Together they formed the Human Coalition. The name was chosen deliberately. Humans had started this war, and humans remained at its heart. But the coalition was not about human supremacy. It was about freedom for all species. The Dominion had never faced anything like this before. For 3,000 years they had conquered divided species, one at a time. Now they faced a united alliance that grew stronger with every defeat. The High Arbiter Kethvar watched his empire begin to crumble, and he made a decision. If the humans could not be conquered, they would be destroyed completely. He began gathering the largest fleet in Dominion history, 2,000 warships from every corner of the empire. This armada would not try to enslave Earth. It would burn the planet to ash and scatter humanity to the void. The High Arbiter believed this would break the coalition. Kill the humans and their slave rebellion would collapse. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The Dominion Armada was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history. 2,000 warships crewed by over 5 million. Valkyrie soldiers, High Arbiter Kethvarn, commanded the fleet personally from his massive flagship, the Eternal Judgment. He had waited 3 years to gather this force, and he was certain it would be enough. The humans had perhaps 500 ships at most. Their alien allies had maybe 300 more. Even with their clever tactics and fierce determination, they could not defeat such overwhelming numbers. The Armada entered the Sol system expecting to find desperate defenders scrambling to protect their homeworld. Instead, they found nothing. No fleet waited at the edge of the system, no defense platforms orbited the outer planets. Earth itself was dark and silent with no communications and no visible military activity. Kethvarn felt a cold uncertainty creep into his mind. This was wrong. Humans did not flee, and they did not hide, they fought to the death against impossible odds. Every report from every battle confirmed this. So where were they? He ordered his fleet to proceed cautiously toward the inner system. Scout ships spread out in all directions, scanning for any sign of human activity. The main fleet moved past Neptune, and then Uranus with no contact. They passed Saturn and its rings of ice and dust, and still nothing. By the time they reached Jupiter, the Valkyrie commanders were openly confused. Had the humans abandoned their homeworld? Had they fled to some distant colony to escape destruction? Then the first scout ship detected an energy signature behind Jupiter's largest moon. Then another, then 100 more, then 1,000. Admiral Marcus Webb Jr. commanded the coalition fleet from the bridge of the UE's Vengeance. He was the son of Karl Marcus Webb, who had designed the first human warship, and he had spent his entire adult life preparing for this battle. For 3 months, the coalition had hidden their fleet in the shadow of Jupiter. They had powered down their ships and waited in cold darkness while the Armada approached. It was the largest ambush in the history of warfare. 400 human warships emerged from hiding first. They were followed by 200 Keth vessels bristling with weapons and hungry for revenge. 100 Moravi carriers launched thousands of fighter craft that swarmed like angry insects. 50 Groth battleships lumbered forward, each one capable of crushing a Valkyrie cruiser with sheer mass, and dozens of smaller squadrons from other coalition species filled every gap in the formation. The Dominion armada outnumbered them, but the coalition had surprise and position, and something the Valkyrie could never understand. They had unity forged in suffering and rage. Admiral Webb opened communications on all frequencies, and his voice reached every ship in both fleets. His words were simple. You came to enslave us. You came to exterminate us. Today, learn what happens when you threaten Earth. The Battle of Sol began. The coalition fleet drove into the armada like a spear into flesh. Human ships led the charge using tactics refined over years of fighting. They did not form neat lines like Valkyrie. Doctrine demanded. They swept in fast, unpredictable groups targeting specific ships with coordinated strikes. The Keth fought beside them with cold, calculated precision. Every Keth pilot had memorized Dominion ship designs during their centuries of slavery. They knew exactly where to hit to cause maximum damage. The Moravi fighters were everywhere at once. Their small craft slipped through gaps in Valkyrie formations and attacked from unexpected angles when Dominion point defense guns tried to track them. They were already gone. The Groth took the opposite approach. Their massive ships absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any other vessel. They crashed through Valkyrie, lines like battering rams leaving chaos and debris in their wake. For 3 days, the battle raged across the space between Jupiter and Mars. Ships burned and broke and died on both sides. Debris fields grew so thick that navigation became treacherous. The communications channels filled with screams and battle cries and last transmissions. The Valkyrie fought with desperation as they realized they were losing. Their commanders tried to adapt, but they had no experience fighting enemies who did not follow predictable patterns every time they adjusted their tactics. The coalition changed approach again. High Arbiter Keth Voran watched from his flagship as his invincible armada crumbled. He had expected the humans to break. When they saw his numbers, he had expected their alien allies to flee when the battle turned against them. Instead, they fought harder. Ships with failing life support continued firing until their crews suffocated. Crippled vessels rammed into Dominion ships rather than retreat. Pilots who ran out of ammunition crashed their fighters into enemy bridges. The High Arbiter had never seen anything like this. He had conquered 300 species, and none of them had fought with such fury. On the second day of battle, the Keth flagship positioned itself next to the Eternal Judgment. The Keth commander was named Chitkara, and she had been born a slave. Her parents had been slaves. Their parents had been slaves. For 20 generations, her people had served the Dominion. Now she looked at the High Arbiter's ship through her viewport and spoke on an open channel. 800 years, she said. 800 years you kept us in chains. Today, we break them forever. Her ship rammed the Eternal Judgment at full speed. Both vessels died together in a blast of light that was visible from Earth, but the High Arbiter survived. His personal shuttle had launched moments before impact, carrying him away from the destruction. Coalition ships captured the shuttle within hours. Keth Voran expected to be executed. Instead, the humans took him prisoner and treated his wounds and told him he would face trial. He did not understand. The Dominion executed captured enemies. They did not waste resources on trials. The humans explained that they were not the Dominion. They believed in justice, even for their worst enemies. The Battle of Sol ended on the third day. The Dominion armada was broken over 1,500. Valkyrie ships were destroyed, and another 300 surrendered. The coalition had lost nearly 400 vessels and over 200,000 lives, but Earth was safe, and a High Arbiter would tell the galaxy everything. The trial of High Arbiter Keth Voran was broadcast across the galaxy on every frequency that coalition engineers could reach. Billions of beings watched as the most powerful ruler in known space was made to answer for his crimes. The trial lasted. For 6 months, witnesses came from every species the Dominion had enslaved. They told stories of families torn apart and children born into chains. They described forced labor that worked people to death and medical experiments that treated living beings like raw materials. They spoke of cultures erased and languages forbidden, and entire histories burned, so that slaves would forget they had ever been free. Kefvarn sat through it all and showed no remorse. When asked to defend his actions, he simply said that the strong had always ruled the weak. This was the natural order of the galaxy. The humans had upset this order, but eventually things would return to normal. He truly believed what he was saying. 3,000 years of dominion had convinced him that slavery was right and natural. The judges found him guilty of crimes against sentient life. They sentenced him to spend the rest of his existence in a prison on a dead moon where he would be cared for, but never allowed to harm another being again. Some called for his execution, but the humans refused. Killing him would make him a martyr to those who still believed in the old ways. Keeping him alive and imprisoned showed that justice was possible without becoming the monsters they had fought. The trial changed the galaxy more than any battle ever could. Species that had accepted Dominion rule for generations began to question everything they had been taught. Slave worlds that had never considered rebellion now demanded freedom. Client empires that had served the Dominion out of fear switched their loyalty to the Coalition. Within 5 years of the Battle of Sol, the Valkyrie Dominion collapsed completely. Its fleets were scattered, and its leaders were dead or imprisoned or hiding in the darkest corners of space. The empire that had ruled for 3,000 years was gone, but the work was not finished. The Coalition reformed itself into something new. They called it the Terran Accord, and it was built on principles that humans considered obvious, but that shocked many alien species. The first principle was that no sentient being could be property. Slavery in any form was forbidden, and any world that practiced it would face the full force of the Accord fleet. The second principle was that every species had the right to govern itself. The Accord would not build a new empire to replace the old one. Instead, it would protect the freedom of all peoples to choose their own path. The third principle was that aggression against peaceful worlds would not be tolerated. The galaxy had spent too long accepting that the strong could simply take what they wanted from the weak. Those days were over. Admiral Webb led the Accord fleet for the next 20 years. His ships hunted slavers across the spiral arm of the galaxy. They found hidden Dominion outposts still holding slaves, and they freed them. They discovered pirate kingdoms that had risen in the chaos of the Dominion's fall, and they broke them. They tracked down war criminals who had fled justice and brought them back for trial. The galaxy slowly learned that humanity meant what it said. The old powers watched this transformation with mixed feelings. Some embraced the new order and joined the Accord willingly. They saw the benefits of peaceful trade and mutual defense. Others resented the changes and plotted against the humans. They formed secret alliances and built hidden fleets and waited for humanity to show weakness. None of them succeeded. The humans had learned too much from their history to let their guard down. They remembered how close they had come to extinction on that first Tuesday when the Valkyrie arrived. They remembered the cost of freedom measured in ships and lives and sacrifice, and they remembered that peace was not a gift, but something that had to be defended every single day. 50 years after first contact, humanity was barely recognizable. The species that had been fighting itself when the Valkyrie arrived now led a galactic alliance. The nations that had pointed nuclear weapons at each other now worked together to build ships that defended entire sectors of space. The scientists who had struggled to reach their own moon now developed technologies that other species found miraculous, but some things had not changed. Humans still argued and disagreed and competed with each other. They still had different beliefs and different values and different dreams. They simply know Longer let those differences make them weak. Dr. Yuki Tanaka lived long enough to see the 50th anniversary of first contact. She was 102 years old and had spent decades training the next generation of human scientists. On the anniversary, she gave a speech that was watched across the Accord. She talked about that first Tuesday when everything changed. She talked about the fear and the determination and the desperate work in those early years. And she talked about what humanity had become. We were content on our little blue world, she said. We were busy fighting each other and slowly reaching for the stars. The Dominion came and tried to chain us, and they woke something in us that we had forgotten was there. We are not a peaceful species. We are not a gentle species, but we know what it means to fight for freedom, because we spent our whole history fighting for it, and now that fight belongs to everyone. Her words became famous across the galaxy. They were translated into thousands of languages and taught in schools on hundreds of worlds. They captured something essential about humanity that other species had learned to respect and fear. Humans were dangerous. They were unpredictable. They fought with a fury that seemed out of proportion to their small, soft bodies. But they were also capable of mercy and justice and sacrifice for others. They freed slaves they had never met and protected worlds that could offer nothing in return. They were terrifying friends and even more terrifying enemies. 100 years after first contact, human ships patrolled the trade routes of a dozen sectors. Human diplomats negotiated treaties between species that had been enemies for millennia. Human doctors trained medical students from across the galaxy, and human soldiers stood ready to fight anyone who threatened the peace they had built. The Valkyrie had come to Earth seeking easy slaves. They had found something else entirely. They had found a species that would not kneel, a species that learned from its enemies and improved with frightening speed, a species that shared freedom as fiercely as it defended it. The galaxy had tried to enslave Earth. Now the galaxy looked up at the stars and saw human war fleets watching over them. Some saw protectors, others saw conquerors waiting to reveal their true nature. But all of them understood one truth. Humanity had been content to stay on its small world. The Dominion had forced them out among the stars. And now the galaxy would never be the same. When young species looked up from their worlds and wondered if they were alone, the answer came on human frequencies in 100 translated languages. You are not alone. You are not property. And if anyone tells you otherwise, the fleet will come. The galaxy had learned to run from human war fleets, but those who had earned humanity's friendship knew they had nothing to fear, and those who preyed on the weak learned to fear everything. This was the legacy of that first Tuesday. This was what humanity had become, not conquerors but guardians, not tyrants but liberators. The wolves of Earth had found their purpose among the stars, and they would never stop hunting.